I am today announcing my candidacy for the presidency of the United States.
The most important words of my life.
I'm here tonight.
I stand
before you today
to declare that I am a candidate
for President of the United States.
I am running
for President of the United States.
I officially announce my candidacy
for President of the United States.
I'm President.
I am officially running
for President of the United States.
From the University of Virginia Center for Politics, this is Sabato's Crystal Ball, America Votes.
Cannon House Office Building, please.
My name's Kyle Matus. I'm the Director of Government Relations at the One campaign.
I am the connection maker here in Washington. Our organization is a grassroots organization, volunteers across the country who are dedicated, like we are, to ending extreme poverty and preventable disease in Africa. Hey, Representative Roby, good to see you again.
Good to see you too. I'm glad you're here.
Appreciate it.
Hey, Kyle, welcome back.
Hey, thanks. My job is to make sure that members of Congress know what it is that we're working on and that their constituents deeply, deeply care about these issues.
My name is Olivia Beavers. I'm a political reporter for the Hill newspaper in Washington, D.C. Right now is probably the busiest time for political reporters. There's a constant flow of news, and there's the 24-hour news media, so things just move really rapidly. This is the third impeachment hearing in modern times, and after less than 3 years of doing print reporting at the Hill, I'm the one in the room. I always hoped I would get to this point.
Democracy is crucial. My parents, they came to the United States for that reason. Democracy is everything. My name's Somar Metwali, and I'm a government major. One of the reasons that I really wanted to come to UVA is because of the Center for Politics. I was just inspired to really jump into what the center does when I saw how they encourage students to really explore politics. Politics is difficult, but I think the center makes it all accessible. I think the center makes it all available, and I think the Center for Politics is there to make sure that we're supported.
I graduated in 2007, a degree in American politics. First started working with the Center for Politics by way of a class with Professor Sabato. The core questions of law, of policy, of politics have always interested me and motivated me. And the Center for Politics took that interest and provided a springboard for me to dive into deep questions and also find a job and an internship, and made me realize some of the opportunities that are out there that could be made available to someone like me from small town Texas. These are opportunities that I didn't know existed before coming to UVA.
What was sort of the big moment during the first open impeachment inquiry yesterday? The Center for Politics certainly opened doors for me. I was actually their first scholarship recipient. It allowed me to get an internship at the White House and pay for it at a time when I wasn't sure if I would be able to accept the position, and it's helped me in my career ever since. It's hard sometimes if you don't fully understand what this world's like to get involved, but the Center for Politics made politics come alive.
My opportunities with the center have actually led me to other opportunities at the university as well. And I think it's because of the skills that I've learned through the center, with development, with programs, how to put on successful events. I mean, these are things that you need in every single field. I'm just so thankful for that.
The Center for Politics changed the trajectory of my life. It made Washington, D.C. much more accessible and helped me understand that there was a place for me to come and serve my country in a way that I didn't know was possible.
A lot of us that are interested in politics, we want to run for office, we want to be Hill staffers, we want to make sure that the cogs of government move in the right direction. And I think the center has really shown that it's all possible. You just have to take your own path there.
Those were terrific interns. I remember them well, all of them, and there are hundreds more like them. You've seen some of the outstanding ones here in that video, and I'd like to thank all of them. We're happy to have played some small role. It's really their talents and abilities that have carried them forward. But that's what we try and do at the Center for Politics, and we welcome your support so that we can do even more of it. And welcome to you as we begin our 9th Crystal Ball webinar. And as always, I'm going to turn it over to our managing editor, Kyle Condick, to get us started. Kyle?
Thanks, Larry. Also joined today by a third member of our team, Miles Coleman. So we're recording this late morning, Thursday, October 15th. This was supposed to be the day of the second debate. Instead, we're going to be having competing town halls tonight with Joe Biden and Donald Trump, which has led, of course, to controversy because they're happening at the same time. This is the first time, if this is your first time viewing the program, please hit the subscribe button on YouTube to follow our YouTube channel, UVA CFP. And this webinar is available on YouTube. It's also available as a podcast on Apple, Spotify, and other providers. An update on our three-part documentary series on the challenges facing democracy, dismantling democracy. That's now going to be available on Amazon Prime starting tomorrow, October 16th. So look for it there. And finally, if you want to support the work of the Center for Politics, please just text USA Votes to 41444. USA Votes to 41444. In the second half of the program, I'm going to be talking with Grace Panetta of Business Insider about early and mail-in voting. And of course, as we're talking right now, I think 17 million votes have already been cast, and that number is just going to keep going up. 137 million votes cast in 2016. I think a lot of us expect the number to be a lot larger this time. So with that, let's get into the actual meat of the program here. What we did before we recorded is we did a little draft of the top 15 Senate races as a way to talk about them. And we went in order of which ones we thought were likeliest to flip. Miles got the first pick, Larry got the second pick, I got the third pick. And so we're going to use that as a way to go through our ratings. What I want to do first, though, is just bring up our Senate rating map. So Jason, if you could bring up that map. So Senate 53-47 Republican right now. You can see that we have Alabama favored to flip to the Republicans, Colorado, Arizona, Maine favored to flip to the Democrats, a couple of toss-ups, a bunch of leans Republican seats. And so there are a lot of competitive states out there. And so we're going to go through them right now. We can take down the map. We will start the draft. So the first pick went to Miles. Miles picked Alabama. Miles, why'd you pick Alabama?
Yeah, sure. So Alabama, I think it's probably Doug Jones is running about as good a campaign as he can. He's against a mediocre Republican opponent in Tommy Tuberville. But, it's a situation where Jones could end up outperforming Biden by potentially 15 or 20 points, and he could still lose. So that's just how red the state is.
Yeah, absolutely. So second pick went to Larry. Larry picked Colorado. And so, Larry, you can talk about that. But we also have a question related to Colorado from a reader that I wanted to get to. This is from Nancy Ognanovich from Bloomberg. Her question is, did Cory Gardner, the Republican incumbent, ever really have a solid chance in this race, given the changing demographics of Colorado and the headwinds caused by being closely associated with Donald Trump?
Answer, no. I mean, if you had a different kind of Republican president running for re-election, maybe he would have. But Colorado has moved clearly into the Democratic camp. Donald Trump is not their cup of tea. And it's pretty obvious that Trump is going to lose Colorado rather badly. And that pretty much condemns Cory Gardner to being a one-term Republican elected in a very good Republican year of 2014, like a number of his colleagues that we're going to talk about. So John Hickenlooper, the governor of Colorado, former two-term governor of Colorado, who was also a popular mayor of Denver, he's running well ahead. He ran briefly for president, wasn't successful there. And, I think it's very likely that he will win handily.
The next pick went to me. I picked Arizona, which I think a lot of people debated between Colorado and Arizona as the likeliest states to flip. Mark Kelly, the Democrat, continues to be a favorite over Martha McSally, the Republican. I could imagine Trump winning Arizona. You can't really imagine Trump winning Colorado, and so maybe that could save McSally, but that is the third likeliest seat to flip. Miles went next. Miles picked Maine.
Yeah, so in Maine, you have Senator Susan Collins, who's up running for what is it, a fifth term? She already has 4 terms.
Yeah.
So she is, I know she's one of these incumbents who is used to getting reelected with 60% or more. She suddenly finds herself in a competitive race, and she's she's really tried to walk the line of being a moderate in the Trump era, and that's just very hard. In most polls, she's struggling to break out of the low 40s against her challenger, Sarah Gideon, who's the Democratic Speaker of their state house there. And one dynamic that we think is going to help Gideon is in Maine they have ranked choice voting. So it's just, to us, it's easier to see Gideon get into that majority under ranked choice voting.
And I think I misspoke. I think this would be Collins is running for a fifth term. She's in her fourth term now. The next pick went to Larry, and Larry picked North Carolina. And we also have another question related to that race from Bill Gooch. My question concerns the North Carolina Senate race and the recent extramarital issues with Cal Cunningham. That's one way of putting it. Has there been any fresh polling or other data that reveals if this issue and Cunningham's strategy for responding is hurting, helping, neutral in this race?
Well, there's been a fair amount of polling since the extramarital affair was revealed. Obviously, many Democratic leaders were furious at Cal Cunningham, the former state senator, who until this point has been leading Senator Tom Tillis, a freshman Republican like Cory Gardner, elected in 2014 in a strong Republican year. Let's just say that despite their anger, Cunningham is still leading. It's questionable whether he lost a point or two or three, or maybe he didn't lose much at all. To me, it demonstrates one thing above all, and that is we are in a kind of post-scandal era. Maybe it's the combination of a Democrat, Bill Clinton, and a Republican, Donald Trump. It makes it difficult for either party to use these sorts of things without being drenched in hypocrisy. Maybe that'll change. We're watching it carefully, because that is the seat that might determine the control of the Senate. Democrats, I think, pretty much had it, and now we've got it as a pure toss-up. We're waiting to see.
The sixth pick of likeliest to flip went to me, and I picked Iowa, where Joni Ernst, the Republican Senate incumbent, has been a little persistently behind Teresa Greenfield, the Democrat. That's been one of the many places where you see incumbents who are running a little bit behind their respective party presidential candidates. I don't necessarily know why that is happening, but it does seem to be a feature of these Senate races. Also, Donald Trump won Iowa by 9 points in 2016. He may very well carry it again, but the state seems markedly closer, which could allow the Democrats to win the Senate seat potentially, even if Trump narrowly carries the state. But that's one I think is an insurance policy maybe for Democrats if North Carolina ultimately goes back to the Republicans. Miles, you had the seventh pick, and you picked Alaska.
Alaska, yes. So this is a race I've been watching all year. Yeah, I know. Well, Alaska is a Republican state, but it tends to do its own thing. It has this libertarian streak. So in Alaska, you have first-term Republican Dan Sullivan, who was elected in 2014. He has a very well-funded independent challenger in Al Gross. Al Gross, he got the Democratic nomination, but he'll always stress his independence on guns. He's going to be a fiscal conservative. And Alaska is a state that's historically very friendly to third parties. Most of the polling we have is fairly close. From what the sense I get, Al Gross is really trying to stick to local issues. So in a state like that, it could definitely work. So this is, as I say often online, this is a race I would not sleep on.
Don't sleep on Alaska. It's on election Twitter. And we'll probably have Alaska a little bit higher here than maybe some other folks, but it's been a really interesting race. The eighth pick went to Larry, and Larry picked a race that's been in the news lately, Michigan, one of the few really competitive seats that the Democrats are defending. And we had another reader question specifically about Michigan from Vivek Ralabandi. He's a high school student from Edison, New Jersey. Vivek, thanks for watching. Seems the Michigan Senate race is getting very, very tight. According to two recent polls, CBS YouGov, Peters +3, Siena College, New York Times, Peters +1. Peters is also running behind Biden's margin in both states. Could you discuss why this might be the case?
Yes, and Vivek, thank you for being interested in the crystal ball at your young age, and we hope that will continue for the rest of your life, and we hope you'll bring all your peers in to the crystal ball. We have an enormous number of high school and college students who follow us, and we're very pleased because you'll be running politics in just a few years. Look, Michigan has been fascinating because other than Alabama, which is a near sure turnover to the Republicans, Michigan is really the only other state where Republicans could possibly defeat a Democratic incumbent as far as we see it. And Peters has been a very low profile senator. He was also elected in 2014. This 2014 class is not doing terribly well in 2020, mainly Republicans, but Peters has been low profile. He's running against a dynamic African-American Republican candidate, John James. But Peters has something that James can only dream of, and that is a presidential candidate who this time, as opposed to Hillary Clinton in 2016, has a good chance to a very good chance to actually carry Michigan, and maybe by 5 or 6 points. That ought to be enough to pull Peters in. Peters will probably not lead the ticket. He will be behind Biden. That's our guess anyway. So it's coattail more than anything else that may save Peters. But by no means is that a sure thing. We're watching that carefully, and we think that James has a lot of potential, though he also lost the other Senate seat. Usually when you lose both Senate seats, you're headed for another occupation.
Ninth pick went to me. I took the regular Senate election in Georgia, where David Perdue, the Republican, is running for re-election against John Ossoff, Democratic candidate who lost a famous special election in the Georgia 6th Congressional District in 2017. We also had a reader question from Dan George, specifically about Georgia. If turnout is high in Georgia, which so far it is, does John Ossoff have a really good chance of winning outright and avoiding a runoff? If the race goes to a runoff, does that mean that Ossoff has no shot of winning based on past special Senate results in Georgia? So there is a possibility that either Perdue or Ossoff could win without a runoff. There's a libertarian in this race, too. Georgia's the only state that has a general election runoff, meaning that you have to get to 50% in November to get over the finish line. And I wonder if the libertarian will sort of end up preventing both candidates from doing that. It seems like Perdue is doing a little bit better than Trump in Georgia. Georgia is very, very close for president at this point. And if this does go to a runoff, the history suggests that Republican turnout would be better in the runoff, but there might be 2 Georgia Senate runoffs on January 5th, 2021. And so there would probably be a lot of interest, and potentially the turnout model could be different. We also don't know who's going to win the presidential race. And you know, the Georgia Senate races might be the first opportunity for voters to do what they often do, which is to cast a vote against the White House. Or in this case, potentially the incoming occupant of the White House. So there's a lot to unpack there. Part of the reason we continue to have it lean Republican is that we think the runoff maybe could benefit David Perdue, and Perdue is doing a little bit better than Trump in the state, but it is very close and competitive. The next pick, the 10th pick, went to Miles. Miles picked Kansas.
Yeah, so actually, Larry, you were talking a little bit earlier about how we really appreciate the high school students who follow us. Well, someone who always makes sure that this race is on our radar is one of our best followers. His name is Jackson Bryman. He is in 10th grade. He always gives me some great analysis of that sort of race. And basically in Kansas, you have a situation where the Democratic nominee is State Senator Barbara Bollier. Her base is sort of in Johnson County, which is probably one of the likeliest counties in the country that's going to flip from Trump to Biden. I've heard that she's going to get a very good showing there. It's a big suburban county that is a lot like those in a place like Texas or Georgia. So if she gets a good showing there, we think she could have a chance. She's running against Congressman Roger Marshall, who at first we thought that the Republicans sort of caught a break when they nominated him over Chris Kobach, who was used to be their Secretary of State. It was a little more controversial, but we really haven't been too impressed by Marshall's campaign. Most of the internal polls that I've seen from his campaign have him running a bit behind Trump. So we still have this race as leans Republican, but it's one of those that Democrats think they can make a serious effort here.
The 11th pick went to Larry, and Larry took South Carolina, a race that's been very much in the news.
Democrats are hoping, maybe beyond hope, that Lindsey Graham is going to be shown the exit. And of course, Lindsey Graham is on our TV screens all day, every day these days because of being chairman of the Judiciary Committee with the Supreme Court pick. But Graham has become very controversial for his flip-flops as much as anything else, being very anti-Trump in 2016 and now being Donald Trump's best friend and not agreeing to take a look at Merrick Garland in 2016 for the Supreme Court, but finding some weird reason why the new nominee, Judge Barrett, should be looked at in the middle of a presidential campaign, very close to the election. Democrats are really hoping that Jamie Harrison can pull the trick. And sure enough, the polls are tied, essentially. Occasionally, you'll see Harrison up a point or two, but mainly it's just dead tied. And Harrison has been raising money the way no Senate candidate has ever raised it before. Was it 57 million in one quarter? 50, right. Somewhere around there in the third quarter, which broke all the records for Senate seats everywhere. Having said that, Donald Trump is almost certain to carry South Carolina, and probably by a minimum of 5, 6, 7 points, could go up from there. And once again, coattail matters. In a presidential year, it's hard to see Trump not pulling Lindsey Graham across the finish line. But Harrison has given already Lindsey Graham the scare of his life. So we'll see. We're watching it carefully. What an upset that would be. And South Carolina would have 2 African-American senators, one Republican and one Democratic. Who would have thunk it?
I had the next pick, the 12th pick, and I took Montana, which probably collectively on our list is lower than it is for others, in that a lot of people have looked at that as a pure toss-up between the Democratic governor, Steve Bullock, and the sitting Republican Senator, Steve Daines. But, Larry was just talking about coattail in South Carolina. Montana is probably going to be closer than the 20-point margin that Trump had in 2016, perhaps markedly closer. But it's pretty rare for an incumbent senator of one party to lose while his or her party is winning the state for president. And so that, I think, gives Daines a little bit of a boost. We've consistently had him as a small favorite. I do think that race will be very close and competitive. But it is possible that at the end of the day, maybe an Alaska or a Kansas is potentially it's potentially a better target as a flip because of some of the quirkiness of those races than Montana, even though Montana has gotten so much attention. But I think it also goes to show the kind of depth of the list of Democratic targets, in that, there are a number of credible ones that some we've been looking at for a while, like Montana, others like Kansas and Alaska that are maybe newer to the list. So Miles had the 13th pick, and you picked the Georgia special election.
So yeah, in Georgia, we have a strange situation with this special election. In Georgia, with special elections, they're always held under Louisiana-style jungle primary rules. So the Democrats have the Democrat that most support has kind of coalesced behind is Reverend Raphael Warnock. He's a pastor in Atlanta. But on the Republican side, you have appointed Senator Kelly Loeffler, who was appointed by Governor Brian Kemp last year. Loeffler was originally appointed to kind of run for the seat as a candidate who would appeal to women in the suburbs. What's made that a bit more interesting is that one of the other major kind of candidates in that seat is Congressman Doug Collins, who was a very pro-Trump Republican. So it looks like on next month, no one's going to get to a majority or 50%. So we're going to have a January runoff. Warnock, he just got Obama's endorsement. He's black himself. It looks like he's consolidating a lot of that black vote. So he's pretty much guaranteed a spot in the January runoff. We have a situation where Loeffler, for really the past few months, has been racing to her right, trying to outflank Collins. They've generally pulled pretty close to each other. So it could be a situation where in the runoff, you have a situation between Leffer and Warnock where Leffer is having to kind of pivot back to the center. So we still have this race as leans Republican. Maybe one reason for that is in these runoffs, in Louisiana, we're very used to having these runoffs after our primaries. Georgia, not so much. Generally in these runoffs, the Republicans tend to do better. So we're going to have to see if that kind of pattern holds.
Larry, 14th pick, getting near the end of our list here, you took Kentucky and Mitch McConnell.
I took it because I did South Carolina and mentioned that Democrats truly hate Lindsey Graham. Well, they truly, truly, truly hate Mitch McConnell, who is, of course, the majority leader in the Senate. And other than Graham, there's probably nobody they want to see defeated more, at least in the Senate. Nobody touches Trump in terms of how Democrats want to see the election go. Amy Mcgrath is the Democratic nominee. She's a strong candidate. She ran an unsuccessful but very strong race for the House of Representatives prior to this. She had a tough primary. It was a divisive primary, but as far as we can tell, Democrats have more or less recoalesced, and they're coalescing around McGrath. The problem for McGrath is the same problem that other Democrats have had running against McConnell. And unlike other rating services, we have never rated anybody but McConnell the likely or sure winner of that Kentucky seat in any of his prior elections. And we're not doing it now either. Kentucky's going to go for Trump by a very wide margin. Mitch McConnell is as smart a politician as you'll ever find. You may hate him, you may love him, but you don't underestimate him. And so I think he's in very good shape. He is. Clearly, he may be thinking about time in the minority leader's position, but we'll see.
I had the last pick. I took John Cornyn in Texas. It's kind of a similar situation to Purdue in Georgia in that Cornyn usually seems to be doing a little bit better than Trump in the state, but maybe not markedly so. His Democratic opponent, MJ Hagar, she ran for the U.S. House in 2018 unsuccessfully. She has, I think, struggled to kind of get her name ID up in Texas, which, of course, has a ton of media markets and is really expensive. She has brought in more money here down the stretch. And ultimately, I think that Biden is probably likelier to carry Georgia than Texas. But, of course, on a really big night for Biden, maybe he carries Texas. Maybe that's enough to bring to bring down Cornyn. But that's kind of to me, that's kind of more of a deep sleeper sort of race. So just to summarize here, we've got our list of the 15 Senate races likeliest to flip parties: Alabama, Colorado, Arizona, Maine, North Carolina, Iowa, Alaska, Michigan, Georgia regular race, Kansas, South Carolina, Montana, Georgia special, Kentucky, and Texas. So that's our list right now. Collectively, the three of us made. And we'll be watching for developments down the stretch here in these races. We've got time for a few reader questions before we go to my interview with Grace Panetta. First one is from Culver Schmidt, who is a member of our board at the Center for Politics. And he writes, I heard reports in some key states like Florida and North Carolina, Pennsylvania, new voter registration showed significantly more Republicans registering than Democrats. Is that true, and what is the impact on the final vote in those states? So there are some positive voter registration trends for Republicans in some of these states. I recommend, there was a great piece in the New York Times today from Tom Edsall, who talked about this to some extent. One thing to remember, too, about some of these states is that not every state has registration by party, but some of them have kind of like an ancestral Democratic Party registration advantage. So like Pennsylvania has many more registered Democrats than Republicans, even though it's become a swing state. Florida has a few more registered Democrats than Republicans, but the state kind of leans a little Republican. And North Carolina has a Democratic voter registration advantage, too. So one of the things that could be happening here is just that the registration is sort of catching up to the partisan reality. However, Donald Trump springs an upset. These might be the kinds of things that we look at after the fact and say, oh, that was maybe a sign that something was going haywire Biden. That's my reaction to it. I don't know if Larry or Miles had any.
Yeah, well, Kyle, when we did our States to Play article in North Carolina, maybe a few months ago, one of the things we talked about was just within the past decade, you've seen this really big uptick in the number of registered unaffiliated voters in North Carolina. There was sort of that ancestral Democratic action as well, especially in the eastern part of the state, where sort of the Democrats had a lot of room to fall there. But one of the things we looked at is the makeup of the sort of new unaffiliated voters in the state. They tend to skew younger. They tend to skew less white. So this could be a case of voters who are profile as a type of voters who would vote Democratic in general elections. They just may not care to be associated with maybe the two parties. So that's something that could well happen.
Let me add one thing that neither of you has mentioned, because you may not know it. Culver Schmid was one of my first students many, many decades ago, and he is very old. He's quite old. And that's really all I have to say about that. Thank you.
Next question from Jeff Rems. I realize this is a Senate session, but do you have a true upset special in either the Senate or the House or a state in the presidential race? I think some of the races near the end of our Senate races to flip would be upset special. I guess if you want to get a real kind of like deep sleeper, maybe like the Mississippi Senate race is one that we moved to likely Republican recently, although again, that seems pretty unlikely to flip. Any sort of deep sleepers, Larry, that you're looking at?
After 2016, Kyle, I look at every single race. And you just never know. And, rating services like the Crystal Ball, we deal with the data we have and the political intelligence that we can find or are given. And we appreciate everything that everybody does for us to help. But what always is worth remembering is I can't remember a cycle, an election cycle, without some really big, unexpected upset. It is part of politics. It's exciting. We love it. But it means that some of the races, maybe one race, maybe three races, maybe 10 races that we haven't talked about could end up being closer than expected or with upset winners. So don't think we ignore those possibilities. It's just that we work with what we've got.
And one other one that I noticed the other day that, again, this is another total deep sleeper that I don't think would come through in this sort of environment, but the Republicans put out a poll showing that Sherry Bustos, who's the chair of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, who holds a kind of a Obama to Trump district in sort of central western Illinois, they had Bustos up only 5 on her Republican opponent. Again, internal polls usually overstate the party that releases them. We have Bustos as likely Democratic, but that was, and I think also sometimes if you're the chairperson of the the campaign committee, the other side wants to sort of needle you a little bit. But that was one I noticed that was was kind of interesting and sort of cut against the broader story in the House, which we actually wrote about in Crystal Ball today. That Democrats are looking even better, I think, to potentially net some seats. And just one other question that we had from Zeke Phillips. Do we see, there's been all this discussion about the COVID stimulus bill. Do we see any effects showing up in the polls, either against Republicans or against Democrats? Larry, any reaction to that? Do you think there's any sort of political effect?
Well, there is a political effect. COVID has turned into, or the pandemic has turned into, the central issue. It's not that other things don't matter, the recession or, racial inequities and a whole bunch of things that we can mention. But, most people do have their mind on the pandemic, even if, like many Trump supporters do, they're not taking it as seriously as many public health experts think they should. It's what people talk about, what they care about, and in the case of Democrats and independents, what they're worried about. And that's what drives elections. So, yeah, I'd say it's very, very important. Now, how it shapes up precisely, we'll see November 3rd or later. Let's hope it's during election week rather than election month.
And so with that, we're going to go to the second part of our program, in which I talked to Grace Panetta of Business Insider about the early and mail-in voting. And again, votes continue to be cast at a rapid rate. We're already up to 17 million. So thanks again for joining us, and we will talk to you next week. Joined now by Grace Panetta, who's a politics reporter at Business Insider. She's doing a lot of great work on something that is a lot of interest, obviously, to us and to everyone following the election, about the preponderance of mail-in ballots and early voting and what's been going on with all that and all the lawsuits and all that. So Grace is going to help us sort some of that out. So Grace, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So first question is, there's been sort of a theme in a lot of reporting, and I think in some of the early results so far, that it seems like Democrats are much likely to want to vote by mail or to vote early in person, and Republicans are likelier to want to wait until Election Day. Does that seem to be playing out, and is that something we should be watching for in the results?
Yeah, absolutely. So far, we now thankfully have some data from a good number of states, and this is from the U.S. Elections Project. I'm just looking now, and as of today, it seems like about 57% of the mail ballots returned so far are from Democrats, about 23% are from Republicans, and a little under 20% are from voters with no party affiliation. So definitely we're seeing Democrats both requesting ballots at a higher rate than Republicans and returning the ballots that they requested at a higher rate than Republicans, which is a very interesting trend. We're in such uncharted territory with this huge influx in mail voting that it's a little hard to ascertain exactly what this will mean for the eventual outcome. But it's, obviously apparent that President Trump and the Republican leadership's months-long, war on sowing distrust on mail voting is definitely having an impact, it looks like so far.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like even in some states like Florida, where it was pretty common for Republicans to want to vote by mail, that there are actually some folks who maybe voted by mail in the past who might be voting on Election Day. And so you just said it, but I do think it's probably fair to say that the fact that this issue has become politicized, I think, is really showing up in voter behavior.
Oh, yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, and if you tell your voters that mail voting is fraudulent, it has all these problems, issues that are inherent to it, they're going to be less likely to choose that method overall. And we'll see what this means. It's obviously too soon to come to any conclusions about whether it'll benefit Democrats over Republicans, just because there's so much we don't know yet, especially about what the in-person Election Day results will look like. But so far, Democrats are leading in the votes that have been cast, and that also means that for Democratic campaigns, it gives them an advantage, because then they can cross people off their list who have already voted and focus their efforts more on targeting those who have not voted yet, which Republicans don't really have that much of an advantage in that area, because more of their people are more likely to vote in person on Election Day.
I guess one of the counterpoints that has come up is that there is maybe a higher chance of your ballot being rejected if you vote by mail. Maybe you don't put it in the right envelope, or you don't sign it right, or what have you. How much should maybe Democrats be concerned of that if in fact a disproportionate number of their voters are going to be voting by mail?
Yeah, so it definitely is true that we know that mail ballots have a higher rate of rejection than in-person votes. It's been well documented across many studies and in recent years, and that's because of the security measures that are in place to, ensure the integrity of mail ballots. So requiring signatures, signature matching, requiring that ballots be returned or postmarked by a certain date. And then you have these wonky things like requiring secrecy envelopes, which really are not don't have anything to do with the integrity of the ballot, but are just sort of an outdated practice. But at the same time, the flip side of that is it's not like in-person voting is entirely flawless and has no issues either. So for example, if you're going to have, 20% more points more Republicans showing up to the polls on Election Day than Democrats, if you wait to vote in person on Election Day, that's your only chance. There are no do-overs. And because of the pandemic, voters may be more likely to run into issues like facing really long lines at the polls, maybe being confused about where to go to vote. A lot of voting locations have changed, and then casting a provisional ballot that may not be counted. Voters may be confused about what ID they need and may show up without a proper ID. So it's also important to note that yes, mail ballots in general are rejected and challenged at higher rates than in-person votes, but it's not as if, in-person voting is a perfect panacea for everyone either.
Yeah, I mean, I think about this sometimes that, we're going to know some statistics about rejection rates for mail-in ballots, but we're not necessarily going to know who might have been standing in a long line and decides ultimately not to vote, or someone who thinks they're going to vote in person and then they have some sort of family crisis or they're scared to go because of the pandemic or whatever. That's something you're not going to really be able to have easy to access statistics on. So it's kind of a trick. It's going to be a tricky thing to try to figure out. Although in a close election, you never know what might take precedent, what might ultimately end up deciding things. There was a lot of conversation. I feel like this was more maybe several weeks ago than now about the whether the post office will be able to handle the volume of the mail-in ballots. Have there been any sort of recent discussions about that?
Yeah, so I mean, overall, I think obviously the post office has just immense capacity to process mail. They estimate that they process over 430 million pieces of mail in a single day. So even if every American voted by mail, that would still only be like 3/4 of what they process in a day. So it's less about total capacity. And obviously because they came under such a huge public spotlight and were sued in federal court by so many states and groups to, be more transparent about what they're doing. I think because of the pressure and the heat that they came under, they really have, made all these public commitments to delivering election mail at timely rates. And so far, it seems like so far things are so good with mail delivery of ballots. It's something that they're prioritizing a lot this year. And obviously, as COVID-19 cases increase, there is, of course, the risk of localized issues with postal service and mail delivery. So if a lot of workers get sick in one region or there's an outbreak and there are fewer staff available, that could affect the timing of mail delivery. But on the national level, it seems like things are, going pretty well.
There was recently a lawsuit in South Carolina over whether absentee ballots would need a witness to sign off on their mail-in ballots. That ended up being upheld, although it was only for ballots cast in after a certain date. There seems to be litigation going on all the time about mail-in ballots, and are there lawsuits that maybe you're looking for that are going to be important between now and the election, and then I guess it's really hard to predict what sort of legal things we might be dealing with after the election. But are there other sorts of things you're following as we get closer here?
Yeah, definitely. And we've just seen just a huge, unprecedented amount of litigation over election rules this cycle. And that's been obviously something that officials have had to contend with. We've seen a lot of decisions in recent days over ballot drop boxes and drop-off locations in places like Texas and Ohio. And there are still some cases in the pipeline. Obviously, we're getting really, really close to the final day of voting, and last-minute court decisions are something that no officials want to deal with right now. But we'd still have some litigation in Pennsylvania. There are some Republicans in the state who appealed a state Supreme Court decision extending the deadline by which ballots can be received from November 3rd to November 6th. They are appealing that to the U.S. Supreme Court. I believe that's still pending, and I think that case is with Justice Alito, since he's responsible for that circuit. We also are seeing some Democratic groups try to appeal to the Supreme Court over Wisconsin's ballot receipt deadline. They had a similar thing where a district court judge ruled that the deadline should be extended 6 days, so ballots that are postmarked by election day are received within 6 days, and then the Seventh Circuit overturned that, and there might be an appeal to the Supreme Court. And then there are some other cases. There's one in Missouri that's currently before the Eighth Circuit, I believe, about whether ballots can be dropped off by hand, because the way their rules are written around mail ballots, if you're voting by mail without an excuse, you have to get it notarized and you have to send it in through the mail. There are no in-person drop-off options. So there's a case ongoing about that too. But yeah, obviously, as we're getting close to November 3rd, I think a lot of officials would like to see these resolved sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I'm also imagining in the case of a close election with all these mail-in ballots that there's lawyers just all over.
Yeah, it's such a nightmare for these officials who are just trying to educate their voters, and to have all these last-minute court decisions going back and forth, it can be really disruptive.
Right. One of the stories of earlier this week it was that we've seen the start of early voting, early in-person voting in some states, and there were extremely long lines in Georgia. Some Democrats, I think, have been claiming that amounts to, voter suppression. I mean, how did you interpret all of that?
Yeah, so it's really important to, understand the context behind these photos and time lapses of long lines. And in Georgia's case, their first day of early voting was Monday, October 12th. And there are always the longest lines on the first day of early voting because people are excited to get out and vote. We saw the same thing in Virginia when they started early voting in September. And in addition, it was also Columbus Day. It was a holiday that a lot of people have off from work. So they went to go vote, and we're just seeing, huge amounts of enthusiasm for voting and possibly record turnout in Georgia. So if you combine all those three factors, it wasn't surprising that there were long lines on the first day. And also a couple factors specific to Georgia that got missed in a lot of these, online discussions about voter suppression is that, since their primary, officials have made a lot of measures to open up new early voting sites and in-person voting locations. So in Atlanta, for example, they're using the State Farm Arena where the Atlanta Hawks play as an in-person voting center. And on the technology standpoint, they're using ballot marking devices, which are machines where you put in your choices on a touch screen, and then that prints a ballot, and you put that ballot into a scanner. And that obviously takes a little bit longer because of that than you might have with just regular paper ballots that go into a scanner. And of course, they can have a certain number of machines that can only be used by one person at a time. So, obviously, yes, in an ideal world, there would be unlimited voting locations and, no lines. But I think given all the circumstances and that it was the first day, it wasn't super surprising, nor was it indicative of anything that's going like horribly wrong. But if we continue to see super long lines throughout the early voting periods in these places like Georgia and Texas that have gotten a lot of attention, that may be indicative of some lack of resources that need to be addressed.
Some states, they've been doing very robust mail-in voting for years and years. Others, I'd say particularly some of the crucial states in the industrial north, like Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, those are states that really had not had like large numbers of mail-in ballots in the past. Some of them kind of got their first experience with this during the primary. There's certain states that we're new to this that handled it well, maybe states that didn't handle it well. Like, what was your takeaway from some of the things we saw during primaries?
Yeah, it was very interesting too, because a lot of states got very lucky. Like North Carolina, for example, held their presidential and congressional primaries on Super Tuesday, right before the pandemic hit, and then we're done. Whereas other states, because of the timing, did not get so lucky. And the officials were put into some, difficult circumstances trying to pull that off. So yeah, 3 states that were a model of really competent, bipartisan scaling up of mail voting that didn't have a lot of experience with it before, I think, where Michigan did a pretty good job, as did Iowa, and Kentucky, where they have a Republican Secretary of State and a Democratic governor. They've historically had very low rates of voter turnout. Before this year, they didn't have no excuse absentee or early voting, and they made a ton of changes this year. So both in the primary in June and now for the general election, they're having people can vote by mail if they're scared of COVID-19, and there's early voting, and they have all these other new provisions like vote centers and other things that were made through bipartisan agreements. And so that was really impressive to see. And then there were the states that struggled a little bit, that have historically had a lot of problems with election administration. And that definitely was apparent, when they tried to scale up mail voting. For example, I'm thinking in June of New York. New York City has long been a problem area, as has Fulton County in Georgia. Has had some issues. Pennsylvania too, when you're talking about these swing states, their primary was a little chaotic, but I know the officials are working super hard because they're under the spotlight to turn things around for November. So it really did come down to luck and resources and all of these factors.
Yeah, one striking thing about Pennsylvania was how different the election night looked compared to when the vote was actually finalized, which I think was like 2 or 3 weeks after the fact. And then it looked like more registered Republicans had voted than registered Democrats. And by the time you got to the end, registered Democrats had strongly outvoted registered Republicans. Is that kind of pattern something we should be looking for on election night?
Yeah, so it definitely depends. There's been a lot of discourse about like a big blue shift or a red mirage, but most of the swing states do allow mail ballots to be processed before election day. And especially in places like Florida, Arizona, that have a lot of experience with this, we can expect to see that in many cases, the mail ballots and in-person early votes will be the first to be reported. So we might see Biden way ahead in some of these states that allow for pre-processing and are efficient with tabulating ballots. But Pennsylvania is still one of the very, very few states that does not allow officials to even begin processing, doing anything with ballots until the polls open on election day. Both Pennsylvania and Wisconsin are in that boat. Michigan passed some one-time legislation to give their officials 10 hours, on the day before Election Day to process ballots, which is, it's good, but it's not a lot. So in those states where there's very limited pre-processing, we can't expect to see that effect where you have the in-person vote reported first and it's favorable to Republicans, and then mail ballots get processed and a Democrat could take the lead.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, those states are so important in 2016.
Yeah.
Could be again. So certainly something we're looking for. Obviously they're going to be, we've seen a growing trend of people voting before Election Day. That's been true for the past couple of decades. Do we think that it seems reasonable to think, or maybe curious what your thoughts on this is that, a lot of people are going to get exposed to mail-in and early voting, and they're probably likelier to do that in the future. And do you think that this is going to become more and more popular for voters to take advantage of in coming years?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, even the pandemic has just accelerated so many of the slowly germinating trends in American life in so many ways. And voting is definitely one of those. You're absolutely correct that we were seeing steady upticks in mail and early voting before the pandemic over the past few presidential elections, and especially as Democrats have started taking back state legislatures in places like Virginia, for example. They've since expanded voting options to expand, in-person early voting, allowing anyone who wants to vote by mail without an excuse. So that was already sort of on the way, and scholars had been writing about, over the past few years, hey, we're going to see more people voting by mail. It means we may not know the election results on election night, and then bam, the pandemic hits, and that's our reality. So absolutely, I think this year is going to represent a big turning point towards higher rates of mail-in voting, higher rates of in-person early voting before Election Day, more voting options, and hopefully this year can be the start of us finally having higher voter turnout, partly because of that is more on par with the rest of the developed world, because historically the US has not been a leader in that area.
Yeah, actually, Lisa, the last question. I think the highest voter turnout since women got the right to vote 100 years ago across the country was 64% of those eligible in the 1960 presidential election, famous elections of all time. Although even back then, you had unfortunately a lot of Black Americans really weren't able to vote in that election because of Jim Crow, and also 18 to 20-year-olds could not vote at that time. I'm sort of thinking we should be on the lookout for maybe a record turnout of eligible voters this year, maybe even surpassing 1960. Are you thinking that way too?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's entirely possible. I mean, obviously I want to be, not make any bold pronouncements, but I'm definitely, erring on the side of, we're going to see a record turnout this year. I just think it's not only the fact that many states have made voting easier due to the pandemic, but that the pandemic has just highlighted and been such a big wake-up call for people that who is in office really matters. And it's not just the presidency, but your local officials, your county officials, your state legislatures, your governors are such important offices. And I mean, we're already seeing the start of that, really show-stopping record voter turnout in a lot of states. And I think this could be maybe hopefully a new record, and it's the start of a new trend towards more people participating in the process.
Absolutely. Grace, thank you so much for your time. Final thing, do you have any, find your work at Business Insider on Twitter, anything you want to plug?
Oh, yeah. I mean, if you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm Grace_Panetta. I tweet a lot about voting, yelling into the void about voting.
You've done.
They find that valuable in these last few weeks.
You've done a great job of following this over the year and explaining it right now, and so we'll be looking for your work and your assessment. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.